Mob boss saw Waitress with a broken hand in his diner. What he discovered left him shocked. Comment telling me what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10 and let me know which city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story and get to know you better. So please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The rain fell heavily over Chicago that Tuesday afternoon, turning the south side streets into small rivers of muddy water that collected in the clogged gutters. Emily Carter wiped the counter of the Corner Nook diner one more time, her movements careful and precise, despite the throbbing pain in her left arm. The makeshift splint made of cardboard and duct tape was damp from the humid air, and she had to constantly adjust it to keep it from slipping. Her brown eyes scanned the half-empty room, just a few lonely customers sipping coffee and eating grilled cheese while they waited for the rain to pass. Martin Foster was leaning against the doorframe leading to the kitchen, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Emily with a look that made her stomach churn. He was a man in his 40s, with a protruding belly, thinning hair and a thin moustache he kept meticulously trimmed. He always wore shirts that were too tight and fake gold chains around his neck. And there was something fundamentally wrong with the way he looked at her, as if she were his property, something he could take whenever he wanted. The young woman lowered her eyes and continued cleaning, pretending not to notice his attention. She had learned in recent weeks that ignoring him was the safest strategy, that any reaction only encouraged him. The scratches on her face, carefully covered with cheap foundation from the drugstore, still stung when she touched them. Physical reminders of what happened when Martin decided she was being insolent or when they were alone in the storeroom. Outside, a black armored Cadillac Escalade pulled up in front of the diner, completely out of place in this neighborhood of modest businesses and people struggling to get by. Ethan Cole observed the place through the tinted window before signaling to his driver. It wasn't the kind of place he usually stopped, but he knew the owner, a businessman who owed him considerable favors, and he occasionally liked to make his presence felt in the territories under his influence. At 35, Ethan had built an empire in the shadows of Chicago through a combination of brutal intelligence and a sharp survival instinct. His immaculate Italian suit and handmade leather shoes contrasted violently with the diner's simple environment when he entered, rainwater briefly dripping from his umbrella before the driver closed it and returned to the car. The silence that fell was instantaneous. The few customers recognized the type of man Ethan was, even without knowing exactly who he was. There was an aura of power and danger around him, something in the way he moved, with an economy of motion and absolute confidence, like a predator who never had to prove his strength because everyone already knew it. Martin straightened up immediately, his face paling several shades. He knew Ethan Cole, everyone in the business knew him, and his presence there couldn't mean anything good. He started to approach with a nervous smile, wiping his sweaty hands awkwardly on his pants. Ethan ignored Martin completely, his dark eyes scanning the room until they landed on Emily. She was frozen behind the counter, one hand holding the cleaning rag, her eyes wide. Even from a distance, he could see the signs, the poorly disguised scratches, the way she favored one arm, the tension in her shoulders, and especially the way her whole body tensed when Martin moved in her direction. Ethan had spent his entire life surrounded by predators and victims, had grown up on the streets where he learned to read people like others read books, and he recognized perfectly what he was seeing. That young woman was being hunted, and the hunter was right there, trying to approach him with that oily, fake smile. He sat at one of the tables near the window from where he had a clear view of the entire room. Martin approached with a menu, his hands trembling slightly. Ethan ordered a coffee, his voice low but with a commanding quality that made Martin swallow hard and wave frantically at Emily. The young woman approached with hesitant steps, carrying a tray with the coffee cup. Her fingers trembled slightly, making the china clink softly. Ethan observed every detail, the way she kept her eyes down, how her body curved slightly inward, as if trying to make herself smaller, less visible. When she placed the coffee on the table, he noticed the finger marks on her wrist, purple and yellowed, in different stages of healing. Something hot and dangerous ignited in Ethan's chest, a rage he hadn't felt in a long time, not for strangers. He had built his life on controlled violence, on using force as a tool, but always with purpose, never against the weak or defenseless. Seeing those marks, knowing exactly what they meant, awakened something primitive inside him. Emily was turning to leave when she tripped on an uneven spot on the floor, the tray slipping from her hands and crashing down with a clatter that echoed through the silent room. The china shattered on the ceramic floor, pieces scattering in every direction. She let out a small cry of fright and immediately bent down, starting to pick up the shards with violently shaking hands. Martin crossed the room in 3 long strides, his face red with anger. He grabbed Emily by her injured arm, pulling her up with brutal force. She moaned in pain, tears instantly welling in her eyes. But he didn't let go, squeezing even harder as he shook her. His voice was loud and cruel, calling her incompetent, stupid, and clumsy, while the other customers looked down, pretending not to see. Emily just muttered apologies, her face pale with pain and humiliation, trying to pull away from his grip, but without enough strength. Ethan rose from his chair with a dangerous fluidity, his movements as silent as a big cat's. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost soft, but there was a steel-like quality in it that made everyone in the diner freeze. "Let her go now." Martin turned, his face changing from red to white when he recognized who had spoken. His hands released Emily as if he had touched a hot stove, and he took 2 steps back, babbling incomprehensible excuses. Emily fell to her knees, still trembling, her hands automatically continuing to pick up the shards of china as if that could undo what had happened. Ethan crossed the space between them and knelt beside Emily, gently taking her wrist and removing a shard from her hand. His fingers were surprisingly gentle, completely different from the brutal touch she was used to. He helped her up, steadying her when she swayed, and only then turned to Martin. What he said was spoken so low that only Martin could hear, but the manager paled even more, nodding frantically, sweat pouring down his forehead. When Ethan finished, Martin practically ran to the back of the diner, disappearing through the kitchen door. Ethan turned his attention back to Emily, who watched him with wide, shocked eyes. She had never been defended before, never had anyone intervene, and she didn't know how to process what had just happened. He took a clean napkin from the counter and gently wiped a drop of blood that was trickling from a small cut on her finger, caused by one of the shards. "Are you okay?" he asked, and for the first time in a long time, someone genuinely seemed to want to know the answer. Emily nodded mutely, still unable to form words. Ethan watched her face for a long moment, seeing past the cheap makeup, past the fear and humiliation, seeing the real person underneath. There was strength there, buried under layers of abuse and resignation, but still alive, still burning faintly. He returned to his table, took out his wallet, and left a $100 bill next to the untouched coffee. Before leaving, he turned one last time to look at Emily, who was still standing in the same spot, one hand holding the blood-stained napkin. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something passed between them, an inexplicable connection that neither of them was prepared to understand. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Lying in his king-size bed in his Lincoln Park mansion, surrounded by luxury and protected by security guards, he couldn't stop thinking about that young woman with brown eyes and trembling hands. There was something about her that had touched him deeply, maybe because he recognized the pain, maybe because he saw in her a distorted reflection of himself, from when he was young and vulnerable before he built the layers of power and violence that protected him from the world. Emily didn't sleep either. Lying on the thin mattress in her small room in the house she shared with her grandmother, listening to Grandma Rose's soft snores in the next room, she relived every second of that afternoon. The fear when Martin grabbed her, the confusion when that elegant and frightening man defended her, the strangeness of being treated with kindness, and the questions, so many questions about who he was and why he had cared. The next day, Ethan returned to the diner. Martin wasn't there. He had called in sick, and an older employee was covering his shift. Emily was behind the counter, still with the splint on her arm, but her eyes seemed a little less dull, as if something inside her had awakened. Ethan ordered another coffee and waited until the rush subsided before calling Emily over to talk. She approached cautiously, like a wild animal not entirely sure it's safe, and he couldn't blame her. He offered her a job, straight to the point, no beating around the bush, a job in one of his companies, a salary 3 times higher, health insurance for her and her grandmother. Emily stared at him in disbelief, looking for the catch, the trap. Powerful men didn't make generous offers without wanting something in return. She had learned that the hard way. Ethan, reading her thoughts on her face, leaned forward slightly. "I want nothing but your work," he said in a firm voice. "I saw how you behaved yesterday, how you kept working even when injured, how you maintained your dignity even when you were humiliated. I need people like that in my business. The decision is yours." Emily wanted to refuse, every instinct screaming at her to run, not to get involved with this obviously dangerous man. But then she thought of her grandmother, of the medications they couldn't afford, the overdue bills, the rent that was always late. She thought of Martin, who would be back tomorrow or the day after, and would probably be worse because of what had happened. And she thought, for the first time in years, about having a chance at something better. She accepted in a trembling voice, and Ethan nodded, handing her a card with the address of a real estate development firm in the Loop. She was to report there the following Monday, and he would ensure that Martin never bothered her again. When he left, Emily held the card as if it were a talisman, unaware that she had just taken the first step on a journey that would completely transform her life. The first few days at the new job were like entering a completely different world. The firm occupied 3 floors of a modern office building, with perfectly functioning air conditioning, new furniture, and people wearing clean, professional clothes. Emily received a uniform, her own desk, and tasks that, while challenging, were infinitely better than being harassed while serving coffee. The first morning was overwhelming. Emily arrived 30 minutes early, her nervousness making her stomach churn. She spent the first few minutes in the ground floor restroom, looking at her reflection in the mirror, trying to calm her breathing. The new uniform still had the tag on, and she had spent hours the night before choosing which shoes to wear with it. Her worn-out sneakers looked ridiculous now, but they were the only ones she had. The human resources manager, a middle-aged woman named Sandra, greeted her with a professional but genuine smile. She explained her duties with patience. Emily would start in the archives, organizing documents and digitizing old contracts. It was basic work, but it required attention to detail and responsibility. Sandra emphasized that everyone there started at the bottom, that there was room for growth for those who were dedicated. During the first few days, Emily moved through the office like a shadow, trying to absorb everything without drawing attention. She watched how people interacted, learned their names, memorized where everything was. At lunchtime, when others gathered in groups in the break room, she ate alone at her desk, still not comfortable enough to join the conversations. The other female employees were polite but distant, clearly curious about how a girl with no experience had gotten such a good job, but no one asked direct questions. Emily caught the glances, the whispers that stopped when she approached. She knew they were speculating, probably thinking the worst. But she didn't care. She had something to prove, mostly to herself. Emily kept her head down and worked hard, determined to prove she deserved to be there, that it wasn't just charity. She arrived early and left late, skipped breaks to finish tasks, checked everything 3 times before submitting. Within a week, she had already reorganized the entire filing system in a way that made searches easier, creating an index that impressed even Sandra. Ethan appeared at the office with a frequency that surprised even his oldest employees. He had never come so often before, but now he always had some reason to pass by the floor where Emily worked, to ask for reports that could have been emailed, to check on projects his managers could have updated him on. At first, Emily got nervous every time she saw him, her instincts still programmed to expect violence from powerful men. But Ethan was consistently gentle, in a controlled and careful way, as if he knew one wrong move could scare her away. Their conversations started formally about work and tasks, but gradually evolved into more personal topics. He asked about her grandmother, and Emily found herself talking about Grandma Rose, about how she had raised her after her mother's death, about the difficulties with diabetes and the cost of medication. The next day, an envelope appeared on her desk with enough money for 3 months of medication and an appointment with a private endocrinologist. There was no name, but Emily knew who had left it. When she thanked him, Ethan just waved his hand, saying that good employees were investments worth making. Emily began to see beyond the intimidating facade, noticing details that others missed. The way Ethan treated his employees with respect, even the most humble. How he never yelled or humiliated anyone in public. How his eyes softened when he talked about his late father, the only person he had clearly ever truly loved. There was loneliness in him, a vast emptiness that all the power and money couldn't fill. Ethan, in turn, found himself fascinated by Emily in ways he didn't fully understand. She didn't bow to him like everyone else, didn't pretend to agree with everything he said, didn't try to impress him. She was honest in a refreshing, sometimes brutal way, saying when she didn't understand something or when she thought an idea wasn't good. And there was strength in her, a resilience he recognized because he also possessed it, forged in difficult circumstances and impossible choices. Their conversations became the highlight of Ethan's days. He found himself making excuses to go to the office, to spend a few minutes talking with her. He discovered she read romance novels, that she dreamed of going back to school someday, that she loved breakfast but rarely had time to make it properly. He started bringing a box of donuts from an expensive bakery, pretending he had bought too many, leaving the bag on her desk before she arrived in the morning. Emily slowly allowed herself to let her guard down. She discovered that Ethan was incredibly intelligent, that he read philosophy and history, that he had built his empire through strategy as much as force. He spoke of his father with reverence, about how the man had been murdered for not paying protection money to local criminals, about how Ethan had spent years tracking down and destroying every person involved. There was darkness in him. She wasn't naive enough to ignore it, but there was also a code, strict principles he wouldn't break. The tension between them grew gradually, an electric current that pulsed in the air when they were close. Ethan found himself watching the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, how her eyes sparkled when she laughed, how her hands moved when she gestured excitedly about a book she had read. Emily noticed the details about him, how his muscles flexed under his suit when he moved, how his voice got deeper when he was tired, how he always smelled of something woody and masculine that made her want to get closer. But they both kept their distance, aware of the chasm that separated their worlds. Ethan knew that involving her more deeply in his life would put her in danger. Emily knew that allowing herself to feel something for him would be to defy all the lessons she had learned about survival and self-preservation. The situation changed drastically when Ethan's rivals discovered that Emily had become important to him. It wasn't hard. He had been careless. His frequent visits to the office hadn't gone unnoticed. Martin, still resentful for being humiliated, sold information about her to people who had no scruples about using her as leverage. The first sign was a car that started following her home. Emily noticed it on the third day, her street survival instincts finally coming in handy. She didn't say anything to anyone, afraid of being paranoid, but she started varying her routes, constantly looking over her shoulder. Ethan immediately realized something was wrong. He knew the signs of someone being hunted all too well, and Emily was showing all of them. She was paler, her eyes constantly looking for exits, the way she flinched every time a car braked near her. He tried asking gently at first, but she denied it, insisting she was just tired. It was one afternoon when he saw her freeze completely at the sight of a dark sedan parked in front of the building that he could no longer ignore it. He took her to his office, closed the door, and simply waited, his dark eyes fixed on her until she broke down. The words came out in ragged bursts, the car following her, the same men she saw on the corners, the feeling of being constantly watched. Emily admitted she was terrified, that she didn't want to worry him, that maybe she was being paranoid. Ethan felt ice run through his veins. She wasn't paranoid. He recognized professional surveillance when he heard about it. His reaction was immediate and fierce. The civilized businessman persona melting away to reveal the dangerous man he would always be when she was at risk. He mobilized his resources, put discreet security on her, and started investigating who was behind it. He increased security at the mansion, instructed Emily on emergency protocols, and gave her a phone with a panic button linked directly to him and his men. She protested that he was overreacting, but the firmness in his voice left no room for argument. If anything happened to her because of him, because she was in his life, he would never forgive himself. The response came too quickly. Diego Ramirez, a longtime rival who controlled territories on the north side, had decided it was time to challenge Ethan, and using the woman he obviously cared about would be the perfect way to do it. The message came through the usual channels. If Ethan wanted to see her alive again, he would have to cede 3 of his most lucrative territories. Emily was taken in broad daylight, snatched from the street as she was returning from buying medicine for her grandmother. 2 men, quick and efficient, pushed her into a black van before she could scream. The last coherent thought she had, before a bag was put over her head, was that she had been an idiot, that she had allowed herself to believe she could have something better, that security was always an illusion. When Ethan received the news, something inside him broke. For the first time since his father's death, he felt real fear, not for himself, but for someone else. And with the fear came a rage so pure and incandescent that everyone around him backed away. He wasn't going to negotiate. He wasn't going to cede territories. He was going to do something no one expected. He was going to total war. He mobilized every resource he had, called in every favor owed, activated every contact. Within 6 hours, he knew where Emily was being held, an abandoned warehouse on the north side, guarded by 12 men. Diego was there personally, overconfident in his position, certain that Ethan wouldn't risk a direct operation. Ethan proved him wrong. With 20 of his best men, he planned the rescue with military precision. He didn't want Emily to see violence, didn't want to stain her with his world more than he already had. But he had no choice. The operation was swift and brutal, his men entering from 3 different points simultaneously, neutralizing the guards before they could properly react. Emily was in an office at the back of the warehouse, tied to a chair, scared but not broken. Diego had underestimated her strength. He had tried to intimidate her, threaten her, but she hadn't cried, hadn't begged. She just remained silent, her eyes defiant even while bound and helpless. When the door burst open and Ethan entered, time seemed to stop. He looked different, the veneer of civility completely gone. Blood spattered on his expensive suit, a gun still in his hand. But when his eyes met hers, they softened immediately, all the ferocity dissolving into pure relief. He cut her bonds with hands that trembled slightly, the first time Emily had seen him lose his composure. He helped her to her feet, frantically checking if she was hurt, his hands running over her arms, her back, her face, as if he needed to be sure she was real and whole. Emily clung to him, finally allowing the tears to fall, shaking against his chest. Ethan held her tightly, one hand on her back, the other stroking her hair, murmuring words of comfort she could barely hear over the sound of her own ragged breathing. They got her out of there, before she could see the bodies, before she could fully process what had happened. In the car, wrapped in a blanket, Emily began to understand the extent of what Ethan had done. He had risked everything, had started a war, had personally killed to bring her back. And the realization of that fact hit her like a train. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, even wrapped in the warmth of the blanket. Ethan sat beside her, one hand holding hers firmly, the other on the phone giving short, precise orders. Even in the midst of the chaos, he maintained absolute control. But Emily could feel the tension radiating from him in waves, the way his jaw was clenched, how his eyes kept returning to her, checking, making sure she was really there, alive. When he finally hung up the phone, the silence in the car was deafening. The driver and the guard in the front seat stared rigidly ahead, giving them privacy. Emily didn't know what to say, how to process it all. Part of her was in shock, still trapped in that warehouse. Another part was hyper-alert, aware of every sound, every movement. Ethan gently pulled her into his arms, and only then did Emily realize she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. He held her as she fell apart, years of forced strength finally giving way, allowing herself to be vulnerable with the one person she completely trusted. "Why?" she asked in a hoarse voice. "Why did you do this?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his face a mask of control except for his eyes, which burned with raw emotion. "Because I couldn't not do it," he answered simply. "Because the thought of living in a world where you don't exist is unbearable." It was the first time either of them had admitted aloud what had developed between them, and the words hung in the car's air like something tangible and powerful. Emily reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, stained with blood that wasn't his. "I don't want to go back to a world where you don't exist either," she whispered. The kiss they shared was inevitable, a collision of emotions that had been suppressed for weeks. It started softly, almost hesitantly, Ethan still afraid of scaring her, Emily still processing everything. But it quickly deepened, years of loneliness and need meeting, hands clutching, bodies pressing against each other as if they could merge. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their eyes wide with the intensity of what they had shared. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, trying to find control. "This changes everything," he said. "My world, my life, it's dangerous. You almost died because of me." Emily held his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. "I was also dying before I met you. Just more slowly," she answered. "Martin was killing me one piece at a time. Poverty was killing me. Hopelessness was killing me. You gave me life, Ethan. For the first time in years, I have something to live for beyond just surviving." The following weeks were chaotic. The war with Diego Ramirez escalated. But Ethan had the advantage of having struck first, and with force. Other members of Diego's organization began to switch sides, seeing Ethan's determination and ferocity, understanding that he wouldn't stop until he had completely destroyed any threat to Emily. Emily moved into Ethan's mansion for security reasons, bringing Grandma Rose with her. The grandmother, who had spent her entire life in small, simple houses, was initially intimidated by the luxury, but Ethan won her over with his genuine kindness, his sincere interest in the stories she told about raising Emily alone. Grandma Rose's first week at the mansion was a mix of wonder and discomfort. She refused to let the staff do simple things for her, insisting on making her own bed and washing her own dishes. Ethan found her one morning in the enormous kitchen, trying to figure out how to use the Italian coffee machine, her hands shaking with frustration. With infinite patience, he sat with her and showed her every step, not just of the coffee machine, but of all the modern appliances that confused her. Grandma Rose, initially tense in his presence, began to relax when she realized he truly cared, that his interest wasn't for show. They developed their own ritual. Every afternoon, Ethan would take 30 minutes to have coffee with her on the back porch, where Grandma Rose liked to sit and watch the garden. She told stories of Emily's childhood, of the difficult but happy years they spent together, of the nights they had no money for food but found ways to laugh anyway. Ethan listened with genuine attention, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just nodding. Grandma Rose, with the wisdom of someone who had lived a long life, saw through his tough facade. She saw the boy he had been, hurt and alone, turned into a man through brutal circumstances. And in her pragmatic but loving heart, she accepted him completely because she saw how he looked at her granddaughter, as if she were a light in the darkness. The young woman found herself living in a world that seemed unreal. Surrounded by bodyguards, living in a house that looked like a palace, wearing clothes that cost more than she earned in months at her old job. But the most surreal thing was the way Ethan treated her, as if she were precious, irreplaceable, as if he considered himself lucky to have her. They explored their connection cautiously at first. Ethan was constantly worried about scaring her, about moving too fast, remembering the signs of abuse he had seen on the first day. Emily was learning to trust again, to believe that kindness didn't always come with a price. Their nights were spent talking, sharing stories, building an intimacy beyond the physical. Ethan spoke of his father, of the poverty of his childhood, of the first time he killed someone at 16 to avenge his father's death. Emily spoke of her mother, of the accident that took her, of the years struggling to care for her grandmother while still trying to be a person. Physical intimacy came gradually. Each step checked and rechecked, Ethan constantly attuned to any sign of discomfort. When they finally made love for the first time, it was transformative for both. Ethan discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that giving himself completely to someone could be empowering rather than terrifying. Emily discovered that her body was capable of pleasure, that touch could heal instead of hurt, that being desired didn't mean being used, but the world around them was not content to let them be happy. Ethan's criminal family, the men who had built their empires alongside his, began to question his decisions. He was getting soft, they said, letting his feelings for a woman compromise his position. There were tense meetings where Ethan had to prove his strength, had to remind everyone why they followed him, why they respected and feared him. At the same time, investigations into the past began to reveal uncomfortable truths. The accident that killed Emily's mother hadn't been an accident. It had been a targeted attack on a police informant who lived in the same building, a bomb that exploded in the wrong car. And the organization responsible had been, years ago, an ally of Ethan's. When he found out, the guilt was devastating. Indirectly, his world had destroyed her life long before they ever met. He tried to hide the information, but Emily eventually found out through documents she stumbled upon in his office. The fight that followed was explosive. Emily felt betrayed, questioned if everything had been an elaborate form of guilt, if he truly loved her, or was just trying to compensate for what his world had taken from her. Ethan, hurt and frustrated, lost his temper, shouting that if he were just trying to compensate, he would have given her money and moved on. He wouldn't have fallen in love, wouldn't have risked his empire. That's when he said it for the first time aloud. I love you. I love you more than I've loved anything or anyone in my life. And I know I don't deserve you, that my world killed your mother and destroyed your life, but I can't undo that. I can only try to build something better. Emily stared at him, tears streaming down her face, anger and love warring within her. The truth was, she loved him too, desperately, completely. And though his world had taken her mother, it had also given her him, had given her a chance to be more than just a victim. They met in the middle of the room, clinging to each other, crying for the first time together, releasing years of pain and loss and loneliness. And in that moment they decided they wouldn't let the past define their future, that they would build something new, something of their own. Ethan's decision to start moving away from crime came gradually. He began by transferring legitimate operations to his real name, using the intelligence he had always used for crime to build real businesses. The real estate firm where Emily worked became completely clean, and other businesses followed. The transition was meticulously planned. Ethan spent months meeting with specialized lawyers, accountants, and business consultants. He created a complex but legal corporate structure, completely separating his legitimate companies from the questionable operations. He sold territories to rivals he respected, made deals with others to stay out of each other's way. The first to resist were his own men, loyal but conditioned to a certain lifestyle. Many didn't understand why he would choose legitimacy when crime was so much more profitable. Ethan had to make difficult choices, cutting ties with people who had been with him for years because they couldn't make the transition. There were nights when he lay awake, questioning if he was making the right choice, if he was betraying everything he had built. But then he would look at Emily, sleeping beside him, remember the child they planned to have, and knew he had to do it. He couldn't raise a family while keeping one foot in the world that had almost killed her. It wasn't easy. There was resistance from all sides. There were attempts at sabotage. There were moments when it seemed impossible. Legitimate businessmen distrusted him. Banks were reluctant to do business. Suppliers demanded payments up front. But Ethan was strategic, careful, and had Emily by his side, who proved to have a natural talent for business, who saw angles he missed, who complemented his skills perfectly. She became his anchor during this tumultuous period. When he doubted, she reminded him why. When he got frustrated with the bureaucracy and limitations of the legal world, she pointed out the benefits: sleeping without fear of betrayal, building something he could pass down to his children without shame, having genuine relationships not based on fear or interest. Emily flourished in this new role. She was no longer the scared waitress trying to become invisible, but a confident woman who knew her worth, who wasn't afraid to challenge even Ethan when she thought he was wrong. She went back to school, took courses in business administration and accounting, became a business partner as much as a life partner. Grandma Rose, her health improving with proper treatment, watched her granddaughter's development with quiet pride. She had liked Ethan from the beginning, seeing past the frightening reputation to the lonely man who treated her Emily as if she were made of something precious. 2 years after they met, Ethan asked Emily to marry him on a quiet night at home, just the two of them and Grandma Rose. There was no grand production, no expensive restaurant or extravagant gestures, just Ethan on one knee in the living room, holding a ring that had belonged to his mother, asking if she would make him the luckiest man in the world. Emily said yes before he finished asking, throwing herself into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Grandma Rose watched with tears in her eyes, silently thanking a God she barely believed in for sending this dangerous, wonderful man to save her girl. The wedding was small, just close family and a few trusted friends. Ethan had cut ties with most of his old associates, keeping only those willing to follow his legitimate path. There were still dangers. There always would be. But they were manageable, normal compared to the life he used to lead. Emily wore a simple but elegant dress, her face radiant with genuine happiness. Ethan couldn't hold back tears as she walked down the aisle, this small, strong woman who had completely changed his life, who had shown him that redemption was possible, that true love wasn't just a fantasy. Their vows were simple but profound. Ethan promised to protect her, to honor her, and to never stop striving to be worthy of her. Emily promised to stand by his side, to challenge him when necessary, and to never stop believing in the good man she knew he was, even when he doubted it himself. The reception was modest but joyful, filled with laughter and music. Grandma Rose danced with Ethan, telling him to take care of her girl, and he swore he would protect Emily with his life, that she would always be his priority. That night, lying together in their bed, Emily traced the scars that marked Ethan's chest, physical marks of a life of violence. He held her hand, kissing her fingers one by one. "You saved me," he said softly. "I was dead inside before I met you, just functioning, surviving. You brought me back to life." Emily smiled, snuggling against his chest. "We saved each other," she corrected. "I was drowning slowly, and you pulled me to the surface. But you were the one who showed me I could swim, that I was strong enough to survive." Ethan held her tighter, breathing in the scent of her hair, still amazed that she was his, that he had been blessed enough to find her. The years that followed were of continuous building. Ethan's empire became completely legitimate, a collection of successful businesses that employed hundreds of people. Emily became CEO of one of the companies, proving to have exceptional skill for leadership and strategy. They had their first child 3 years after the wedding, a boy named after Ethan's father. Seeing Ethan hold his son for the first time, the tenderness on his normally hard face made Emily fall in love with him all over again. Ethan was a dedicated father in a way that surprised even Emily. He was determined to give his son everything he hadn't had, not just materially, but emotionally. He was present, attentive, loving in a way that defied everything the world expected of him. Grandma Rose lived to see the birth of her great-grandson, holding the baby in her arms and crying with joy. She passed away peacefully 2 years later, surrounded by her family, having seen her granddaughter not just survive, but thrive beyond her wildest dreams. Emily mourned her loss deeply, but also with gratitude for having had her grandmother for so long, for her having lived to see that it had all been worth it, that all the sacrifices had led to something beautiful. Ethan held her through the grief, being her strength when she needed it, understanding the pain of losing the last connection to her original family. But he also reminded her that she had a new family now, that he and their son were hers as much as she was theirs. Over time, Emily also began to work with social causes, using the resources she now had to help women in situations similar to the one she had been in. She created a shelter for victims of domestic violence, offered vocational training programs, and used her own story to show that it was possible to escape and rebuild. Ethan supported every initiative, proud of the woman she had become, of the use she was making of her experiences. He also began to do community work, trying to make up for the damage he had caused for years in the criminal world. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the past came back to haunt him, when old enemies tried to cause trouble, when the temptation to solve everything with violence was strong. But Emily was always there to remind him of who he had chosen to be, of the man he was becoming. And there were days when Emily still woke up with nightmares, memories of Martin or the kidnapping, moments when fear paralyzed her. But Ethan was always there, holding her, anchoring her, reminding her that she was safe, that she would never be alone again. 10 years after that rainy afternoon when they met, Ethan and Emily stood on the porch of their house, watching the sunset over Chicago. They had 2 children now, a thriving business empire, and a life that neither of them would have believed possible. Ethan pulled Emily into his arms, kissing the top of her head. "You know I don't believe in fate," he said, "but sometimes I wonder if we weren't meant to meet, if all the suffering wasn't just to lead us to each other." Emily turned in his arms, looking up at the face of the man she loved. Seeing the lines that age was beginning to trace, but also seeing the eyes that still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Maybe it wasn't fate," she answered softly. "Maybe it was just luck. But it doesn't matter how we got here. What matters is that we chose to stay, that we chose to fight for this, that we choose each other every day." Ethan smiled, that rare, genuine smile he reserved only for her and the children. "You're right, as always, and I'll keep choosing you, every day, for the rest of my life." They kissed as the sun went down on the horizon, two survivors who had found each other in the darkness and created their own light. It wasn't a fairy tale, because their lives had been too real and too harsh for that. But it was true love, forged in fire and tempered by time, and that was more powerful than any fantasy. Their oldest son called from inside the house, needing help with his homework, and Emily laughed, pulling away from Ethan's arms. He watched her go inside, still in awe after all these years, still grateful for that rainy afternoon when he decided to walk into a simple diner and found the woman who would change everything. And as he followed her inside, Ethan thought of his father, dead for so many years, and silently thanked him for having lived long enough to find what the old man never had, not just survival, not just power, but true love and redemption. Ethan Cole's journey from darkness to light was complete, and it was all because a brave young woman with brown eyes and a strong heart had seen past the monster he thought he was and found the man he could become. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you so much.